Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Section: Genuflection to Orthodoxy. Many on the U.S. left have exhibited a Soviet bashing and red baiting that matches anything on the right in its enmity and crudity. Listen to Noam Chomsky holding forth about, quote, left intellectuals, who try to, quote, rise to power on the backs of mass popular movements, and, quote, then beat the people into submission. You start off as basically a Leninist who is going to be part of the red bureaucracy. You see later that power doesn't lie that way, and you very quickly become an ideologist of the right. Quote continued. We're seeing it right now in the former Soviet Union. The same guys who were communist thugs 2 years back are now running banks and are enthusiastic free marketeers and praising Americans. End of quote. Chomsky's imagery is heavily indebted to the same U.S. corporate political culture he so frequently criticizes on other issues. In his mind, the revolution was betrayed by a coterie of, quote, communist thugs, who merely hunger for power rather than wanting the power to end hunger. In fact, the communists did not, quote, very quickly switch to the right, but struggled in the face of a momentous onslaught to keep Soviet socialism alive for more than 70 years. To be sure, in the Soviet Union's waning days, some, like Boris Yeltsin, crossed over to capitalist ranks. But others continued to resist free market incursions at great cost to themselves, many meeting their deaths during Yeltsin's violent repression of the Russian parliament in 1993. Some leftists and others fall back on the old stereotype of power-hungry Reds, who pursue power for power's sake, without regard for actual social goals. If true, one wonders why, in country after country, these Reds side with the poor and powerless, often at great risk and sacrifice to themselves, rather than reaping the rewards that come with serving the well-placed. For decades, many left-leaning writers and speakers in the United States have felt obliged to establish their credibility by indulging in anti-communist and anti-Soviet genuflection, seemingly unable to give a talk or write an article or a book review on whatever political subject without injecting some anti-red sideswipe. The intent was, and still is, to distance themselves from the Marxist-Leninist left. Adam Hochschild, a liberal writer and publisher, warned those on the left who might be lackadaisical about condemning existing communist societies that they, quote, weaken their credibility. In other words, to be credible opponents of the Cold War, we first had to join in Cold War condemnations of communist societies. Ronald Radosh urged that the peace movement purge itself of communists, so that it not be accused of being communist. If I understand Radosh, to save ourselves from anti-communist witch hunts, we should ourselves become witch hunters. Purging the left of communists became a long-standing practice, having injurious effects on various progressive causes. For instance, in 1949, some 12 unions were ousted from the CIO because they had Reds in their leadership. The purge reduced CIO membership by some 1.7 million and seriously weakened its recruitment drives and political clout. In the late 1940s, to avoid being smeared as Reds, Americans for Democratic Action, ADA, a supposedly progressive group, became one of the most vocally anti-communist organizations. The strategy did not work. ADA and others on the left were still attacked for being communist or soft on communism by those on the right. Then and now, many on the left have failed to realize that those who fight for social change on behalf of the less privileged elements of society will be red-baited by conservative elites, whether they are communists or not. For ruling interests, it makes little difference whether their wealth and power is challenged by, quote, communist subversives or, quote, loyal American liberals. All are lumped together as more or less equally abhorrent. Even when attacking the right, left critics cannot pass up an opportunity to flash their anti-communist credentials. So Mark Green writes in a criticism of President Ronald Reagan that, quote, when presented with a situation that challenges his conservative catechism, like an unyielding Marxist-Leninist, Reagan will change not his mind, but the facts. End quote. While professing a dedication to fighting dogmatism, quote, both of the right and left, individuals who perform such de rigueur genuflections reinforce the anti-communist dogma. Red-baiting leftists contributed their share to the climate of hostility that has given U.S. leaders such a free hand in waging hot and cold wars against communist countries, and which even today makes a progressive or even liberal agenda difficult to promote. A prototypic red basher who pretended to be on the left was George Orwell. In the middle of World War II, as the Soviet Union was fighting for its life against the Nazi invaders at Stalingrad, Orwell announced that a, quote, willingness to criticize Russia and Stalin is the test of intellectual honesty. It is the only thing that from a literary intellectual's point of view is really dangerous. End quote. Safely ensconced within a virulently anti-communist society, Orwell, with Orwellian doublethink, characterized the condemnation of communism as a lonely, courageous act of defiance. Today, his ideological progeny are still at it, offering themselves as intrepid left critics of the left, waging a valiant struggle against imaginary Marxist-Leninist Stalinist hordes. Sorely lacking within the U.S. left is any rational evaluation of the Soviet Union, a nation that endured a protracted civil war and a multinational foreign invasion in the very first years of its existence, and that 2 decades later threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast at enormous cost to itself. In the 3 decades after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets made industrial advances equal to what capitalism took a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling their children rather than working them 14 hours a day, as capitalist industrialists did and still do in many parts of the world. And the Soviet Union, along with Bulgaria, the German Democratic Republic, and Cuba, provided vital assistance to national liberation movements in countries around the world, including Nelson Mandela's African National Congress in South Africa. Left anti-communists remained studiously unimpressed by the dramatic gains won by masses of previously impoverished people under communism. Some were even scornful of such accomplishments. I recall how in Burlington, Vermont, in 1971, the noted anti-communist anarchist, Murray Bookchin, derisively referred to my concern for, quote, the poor little children who got fed under communism. His words. End of section.